It would be good to respect the program. We will now listen to His Eminence Metropolitan of Dalmatia, Monsieur Jean, who is actually a representative of the Ecumenical Patriarch at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. He also is co-president of the Commission for the Dialogue between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, and he also happens to be a guest professor at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, which is my university, so we know each other a little bit. Please, the floor is to you.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank His Grace Bishop Cyril of Avidu for having invited me, a very poor liturgist, to this very well-known society of canonists. So thank you for accepting me today. And I would like also to apologize that right after my speech, or right after lunch, with some other people, we have to leave. Not because we are not interested in what you are discussing. I would have loved to hear all the presentations because it's a very important topic for the dialogue. But unfortunately, we have the meeting of the coordinating committee of the Joint International Commission, which is starting tomorrow evening on Leros. So, in Leros, the connection between Debrecen and Leros are not so evident. So this is the reason why we have to leave immediately after lunch. So please apologize me if I'm not staying with you for the rest of the week, but I look forward to reading the proceedings of the conference. Also, I would like to apologize. I will have to shorten quite drastically my paper in order to respect the time allowed, but you have the text, so you are able to read it. I prepared the text not so much as an academic or scientific contribution, there's nothing new, but I prepare my presentation as a reflection how this could help the future of the Joint International Commission, and therefore I look forward for your comments in the discussion. The latest document of the Joint International Commission for the Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, referred as the Kirti document, deals with the theme of primacy and synodality within the first millennium. It came to the conclusion that, and I quote, throughout the first millennium, the Church in the East and the West was united in preserving the apostolic faith, maintaining the apostolic succession of bishops, developing structures of synodality inseparably linked with primacy, and in an understanding of authority as a service, diaconia of love. Though the unity of East and West was troubled at times, the bishops of East and West were conscious of belonging to the one church. Having dealt with the first millennium, it would be logical that the Joint International Commission for the Theological Dialogue between our two churches would examine now the theme of primacy and synodality within the second millennium. This should be discussed these days on Leros, but independently of what will be decided concerning the future theme of the work of the Commission, the aim of my presentation is to reflect on challenges that we encountered in history in the second millennium, both East and West, with regards to the theme of primacy and synodality, and what pseudomorphosis has happened during that period in the consciousness of belonging to the one church. When reflecting on the problems which were caused by the West in the second millennium, with regards to the relations between East and West, one can immediately think of the Crusades. The initial intention of the Crusade was legitimate and pious, free the occupied major Christian centers of the East from the Islamic rule. But besides the question of the authority of the Pope over the East, the attitude of the Crusaders towards the Eastern Christians of that time produced a considerable trauma among the Orthodox, which lasts, unfortunately, until today. Crusaders often pillaged the churches as they traveled, and their leaders often sought to capture territory and have authority over it instead of returning it to the Byzantines. The worst trauma was caused by the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 2004. As a contemporary 12th century Byzantine historian, Nikitas Koniatis, in his Chroniki the Aegisis, puts it, even the Saracens are merciful and kind compared with these men who bear the cross of Christ and on their shoulders. This fracture between East and West, which is a direct consequence of the Crusades, had an immediate consequence the establishment of parallel jurisdictions in the East. At the time of the Latin Empire, the Latin Patriarchate was created in Constantinople in 2004, parallel to the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and other parallel Latin Patriarchates existed in Jerusalem from 1099 until 1291, which was later restored in 1847, as well as in Antioch from 1119 and in Alexandria from 1341. These parallel structures were only suppressed in 1964, so it's very recent when these parallel jurisdictions were suppressed. Father Gregorius Papatomas sees in the constitution of these Latin patriarchates a major ecclesiastical deviation since the creation of parallel jurisdiction, or in other words, ecclesiastico-territoriality, which violates the very antique canonical principle of only one bishop in one city. This phenomenon introduced a radical change in the mindset of Christianity, which only grew over the centuries. Starting from this moment, the Church of the West, the Latin Church of that time, or the Roman Catholic Church, as we put it today, and the Church of the East, the Greek Church of that time, or the Orthodox Church of today, started considering themselves as two distinct, parallel churches, and not anymore as one church. Until now, we have not paid enough attention to the consequences of the creation of the Latin Patriarchates in the East with regards to the question of primacy and synodality. Nevertheless, in the first half of the 15th century, at the time of the Council of Ferrare-Florence, it was still possible to gather in a church council, which ought to be an ecumenical one, as one church, applying the principles of the synodality of the Pentarchy of the first millennium. Actually, it would be interesting to study with a new approach the Council of Ferrare-Florence with regards to the practice of primacy and synodality in the middle of the second millennium. Of course, as a council called to restore the unity of the Church, it was a failure. But as an example of how primacy and synodality was still functioning in the first half of the 15th century, it is an extremely interesting witness. Very often, historiography says that the council was one of opportunity, considering that the Greeks needed the support of the West to save Byzantium. But in reality, the Latins needed the council and the support of the Greeks even more, because the Church of the West was at that time divided between the conciliarist movement and the papacy since the 14th century. The conciliarists believed that the supreme authority in the Church resided in the ecumenical council and not in the person of the Pope. In fact, both parties, the conciliarists and the papacy, sought the support of the Byzantines. Finally, the Byzantines took the side of the Pope by accepting his invitation by applying the system of the Pentarchy. As a matter of fact, the Council of Ferrare-Florence was a prolongation of the Council of Basel, which in 1431 declared himself superior. The Council declared itself superior to the Pope and even began a trial against the Pope. And in 1437, the Pope Eugene IV, pretexting the necessity of restoring communion with the Eastern Church, transferred the council to Ferrare, where the presence of the Byzantine Emperor and the Ecumenical Patriarch were indispensable in order to excommunicate the fathers of the Council of Basel and to cancel its decisions. It is also extremely important to note that while the Greeks and the Latins discussed openly at Florence all their points of divergence, purgatory, filioque, and the Eucharist, with the related questions of the Azim bread and the epiclesis, papal primacy did not occupy at the center of attention. In fact, the definition of the primacy of the Pope in the Council of Florence was aimed at that time to solve not a problem dividing the Christian East and the Christian West, but rather a problem dividing the Church in the West between conciliarists and the partisans of the papacy. A second point is Uniatism as a policy of return to the Church of Rome. The Unionist policy of the See of Rome, conceiving the unity of the Church being realized through a return to the true Church and communion with the Holy See of Rome, is a challenge which arose in the second millennium as a consequence of the creation of parallel jurisdictions. Uniatism reflected a certain ideology which conceived itself as the proper way or method to achieve church unity. This model of church unity was based on a policy of return. The dissident, the so-called dissident or so-called schismatic Orthodox, ought to return to the Roman Catholic Church, which was considered as being identified to the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And the concession granted to the Orthodox was to keep their own liturgical and canonical tradition, considered as a separate rite from the Latin one. The verge of church unity was the See of Rome, in the person of the Pope, acting more and more as a universal pontiff than as a primus inter pares. The sense of synodality was lost. We have from the Joint International Commission for the Theological Dialogue between Roman Catholic and Orthodox Churches two documents dealing with this issue. The document of Freising of 1990 and the document of Ballermann of 1993. While the first one was not very well accepted by the Catholic churches of Byzantine Rite, the document of Ballermann was very much criticized on the Orthodox side and openly rejected by the Church of Greece. The question of Uniatism continued to be discussed within the Joint International Commission at the meeting of the plenary in Baltimore in 2000, which was dedicated to the ecclesiological and canonical implication of Uniatism. The plenary then noted that the two previous documents met with some reserve and even outright opposition sometimes from each side. As written in the communiqué, the discussions of this plenary were far-reaching, intense and rough. They touched upon many theological and canonical questions connected with the existence of the activities of the Eastern Catholic Churches. However, since agreement was not reached on the basic theological concept of Uniatism, it was decided not to have a common statement at this time. For this reason, the members will report to their churches, who will indicate how to overcome this obstacle for the peaceful continuation of the dialogue. Because of that, in fact, the dialogue was interrupted for 5 years. Going back to the previous documents, although the document of Freising recognized that the historical existence of unions cannot be discussed, it rejected Uniatism as a method to reach unity. Paragraph 6 of the Freising document is particularly important, while it states that the term Uniatism designates an effort to realize church unity by separating communities or Orthodox faithful from the Orthodox Church, without taking into account that the Orthodox Church, according to ecclesiology, is a sister church which offers by herself the means of grace and salvation. Uniatism as a method to reach unity was condemned once more by the document of Parliament, which stated, "We reject it as a method for the search for unity because it is opposed to the common tradition of our churches." The presence of the union ecclesial structure also complicated the quest of Christian unity, instead of solving it by creating additional parallel ecclesial structures. The document of Freising recognized that, saying that where Uniatism was used as a method, it has not achieved its goal, that was to bring closer churches, but has provoked new divisions. The document of Freising actually suggested that today our churches come together on the basis of the ecclesiology of communion between sister churches. ecclesiology of communion, which reflects a genuine practice of primacy and synodality, was precisely the weak point of uniatism and perhaps the key to solve the problem of church unity. A third problem is the question of the universal jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. The apex of the tensions between the Christian East and the Christian West came at the end of the second millennium, in the middle of the 19th century, when shortly after his ascension to the papal throne in 1846 and the restoration of the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem in 1847, Pope Pius IX wrote his apostolic letter in Suprema Petri Apostoli Sede, dated of 6th of January 1848. While it was primarily intended for Oriental Christians who entered in communion with Rome through uniatism, it was also addressed to Orthodox Christians, calling them back to unity with Rome. In his letter, Pope Pius IX, considering himself to be placed by divine disposition on the supreme seat of the Apostolic Peter and burdened with the responsibility for all the churches, criticized the Orthodox for not being in communion with his see. The letter praised the Catholic bishops, venerable brothers and beloved sons, and clergy in all orders who have persevered unshakable in faith and communion with this Holy See, and who, no less praiseworthy, have returned to it having recognized their error. For this reason, Pius IX's letter has been characterized by the Dominican Ivan Nichols as the first unionist encyclical of the late papacy, but at the same time as a papal concern for the Christian East of a depth and urgency not seen since Florence. This apostolic letter, encyclical, provoked a vigorous reaction from the East, which was expressed by the famous encyclical of the four Eastern Patriarchs of 1848, signed by Patriarchs Antimos VI of Constantinople, Hierotheos II of Alexandria, Methodius of Antioch, and Cyril II of Jerusalem, along with the Holy Synod's members of each of the Patriarchates. I should stress, and we will see it, that this letter was written in a polemical context, and we have to recognize this polemical character of the 19th century, as Metropolitan Maximus yesterday emphasized. One can see from the very form of the composition of the letter of the four Eastern Patriarchs the expression of synodality as maintained in the Orthodox Church, as opposed to the centralistic vision of the Pope Pius IX, already seeing himself as the bishop of the Universal Church. Besides attacking the so-called heresy, I use the term heresy in brackets because it's used for the first time in this encyclical letter, of the Filioque as a new doctrine, contrary to John 15:26 and the symbol of faith. This is in paragraph 5 and 6 of the encyclical. The encyclical attacked Pius IX, saying, usurping as his own possession the Catholic Church of Christ by occupancy, as he boasts, of the episcopal throne of St. Peter, he desires to deceive the more simple into apostasy from orthodoxy, choosing for basis all theological instruction these paradoxical words. Nor is there any reasons why he refuse a return to the true church and communion with this my holy throne. Paragraph 12. Besides his synodical form, the encyclical of the Eastern Patriarchs is also interesting with regards to the question of primacy and synodality, since it recognizes explicitly the primacy of the See of Rome. The encyclical says, who denies that the ancient Roman Church was apostolic and orthodox? None of us will question that it was a model of orthodoxy. Will any of the fathers or ourselves deny her canonical privilege in the rank of the hierarchy, so long as she was guided purely by the doctrines of the fathers, walking by the plain rule of Scripture and the holy synods? Nevertheless, the encyclical condemned the See of Rome for its innovation, not for its primacy, but for its innovation. It also criticizes the Pope of Rome for having transformed his role of being primus inter pares into a jurisdictional supremacy. And here I quote paragraph 13. We see that the very primacy for which His Holiness now contends with all his might, as did his predecessors, transformed from a brotherly character and hierarchical privilege into a lordly superiority. The encyclical emphasizes that primacy of the Church of Rome was not a personal jurisdictional supremacy of the Pope, but a primacy of honor of the See, being the capital of the empire. The encyclical then underlines that the cause of these innovations is actually due to a lack of synodality. I quote the next paragraph. Moreover, neither patriarchs nor consuls could then have introduced novelties among us, because the protector of religion is the very body of the Church, even the people themselves who desire their religious worship to be ever unchanged and of the same kind as that of their fathers. It is interesting to note in this passage that the very famous phrase of the encyclical stating that the protector of religion is the very body of the Church, even the people themselves, should be understood not as the privilege of the laity as opposed to the hierarchy or the episcopacy, but, as it is often interpreted, quoting this encyclical, but as the application of the very principle of synodality, according to which the protos, or primate, is not over the synod or over the church, but among the synod, in which each bishop recapitulates the entire body of his local church. But the apex of the practice of the universal jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome and its infallibility found its formulation at Vatican I in the dogmatic constitution Pastor Eternus, promulgated by Pope Pius IX in 1870. In a patriarchal and synodal encyclical dated of 1895 and signed by the Ecumenical Patriarch Anthimos VII and the 12 metropolitans of the Synod, reacted directly to this new dogma. The encyclical is in fact a response to the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII of June 1894, in which the method of unionism was connected with the dogma of universal jurisdiction. It is important to underline that in their encyclical, Patriarch Anthimos VII, with the members of his Holy Synod, do not reject the quest of the unity of the Church, since, as they put it, no doubt every Christian heart ought to be filled with longing for union of the churches, but stress that this sacred longing, our Orthodox Church of Christ is always ready to accept any proposal of union if only the Bishop of Rome would shake off once for all the whole series of the many and diverse anti-evangelical novelties. Therefore, according to the encyclical, the unity of the Church ought not to be realized through union with Rome, neither through the exercise of the universal jurisdiction of the Pope of Rome over the other local churches, but through the correct exercise of synodality, according to which the protos is a member of the synod to which he is submitted. Having thus reminded that the protos is not over the synod, but among the synod, the encyclical underlines that the prerogatives of the Bishop of Rome as primus inter pares were linked with the position of his see within the empire. The encyclical recalls that on a universal level, questions were resolved in a synodical way through the councils which were the supreme authority. I quote paragraph 16. But on important questions which needed the sanction of the universal church, an appeal was made to an ecumenical council, which alone was and is the supreme tribunal in the universal church. The maximalist vision of the universal jurisdiction as the Pope as developed in the 19th century and as defined by the Council Vatican I, combined by the policy of unionism, has definitely traumatized the mindset of the Orthodox. Even though the dogmas of Vatican I have been somehow balanced by the ecclesiology of Vatican II, it is not clear for an Orthodox mind how the traditional principle of primacy and synodality could be preserved by the dogmas of Vatican I. This is an issue that ought to be seriously clarified, and this is why the former co-president of the Joint International Commission for the Theological Dialogue between these two churches, Cardinal Walter Gasper, was calling for a relecture of Vatican I through the lenses of Vatican II. The problems of primacy and synodality in the second millennium do not only concern the Roman Catholic West, but also the Orthodox East. My fourth point is showing how during the Ottoman occupation and when the ecumenical patriarch became the ethnarch for the Orthodox in those lands, somehow the ancient patriarchates of the East, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, were somehow absorbed by the ecumenical patriarchate, but nevertheless, the synodical practice of the Church was preserved. Due to lack of time, I will pass on this point. I am coming to the fifth point, the so-called synodal period in the Church of Russia. The beginning of the 18th century in Russia was marked by sweeping reforms carried out by Peter the Great, who established in 1721 a collective supreme administration known as the Holy and Governing Synod, and the suppression of the Patriarchate. This period in history of the Church of Russia is known as the Synodal period, but the administration of the Church during the period is quite different, even stranger, from one would expect from the practice of primacy and synodality in the first millennium. It was modeled after the Lutheran models. The members of the synods were not exclusively bishops chosen by the Church, but consisted of 12 members, 4 archbishops, 6 archimandrites, and 2 priests, all nominated and dismissed by the Tsar. The Holy Governing Synod, based in St. Petersburg and presided by the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg, subject to the Tsar, was nothing else than a pseudomorphosis of the practice of synodality of the first millennium. The Holy Synod rendered an annual account of its affair to a lay procurator who in fact governed the Russian Church. The Synod remained the supreme church administrative body in the Russian Church for almost 2 centuries. The Patriarchate was only restored by the Council of Moscow of 1917-1918, which ought to re-establish the canonical practice of primacy and synodality. Nevertheless, because of the heritage of the synodal period of the influence of the Slavophile movement and the democratic tendencies of that epoch, the Council was much influenced by principles foreign to the canonical tradition of Orthodox Church. As the Assembly Cyril pointed out, the notion of sobornost, as developed by the Slavophile, played a determining role at the Council. For the greatest representatives of the Slavophiles, as Alexei Khomyakov, the notion of sobornost undermined the collective dimension of the Church, in which all the Christians, laymen, clergy, and bishops have the same rights. Consequently, the Council of Moscow considered the Church as composed by different groups with different interests, who ought to be represented in the administration of the Church, the bishops, the clergy, the monks, and the laymen. Father Nicholas Afanasiev, who has been quoted several times since last night, made a severe critique of the Council of Moscow, saying that its notion of representativity introduced in the administrative system of the Church destroyed the unity of the ecclesial body. Furthermore, he declared, how could an election of representatives of laity could invest them with the Ministry of Administration and grant them a corresponding grace? If the elected representatives of the laity do not possess the gift of administration, how could they conduct the Church? Naturally, the Council of Moscow did not deny the charismatic gifts of the bishops for administration, but by putting on their sides laymen who, according to the current conception, are not consecrated, it declared that these charismatic gifts were superfluous for the administration of the Church. In any case, the administration of this charismatic organism became non-charismatic and was laicized in the bad sense of the word. Such an understanding of conciliarity based on the notion of sobornost of the Slavophiles is completely stranger to the tradition of synodality as developed by the ancient canons. Nevertheless, it still creates today a lot of confusion concerning the theme of primacy and synodality in the Orthodox Church today. My sixth and last point is the problem of ethnophilitism and autocephalism. Another problem which appeared in the 19th century in the East is the problem of ethnophilitism, which was condemned by the Council of Constantinople of 1872. It is important to emphasize that the Council of 1872 did not condemn religious nationalism simply as a modern ideology, but saw in this problem a major ecclesiological problem. The cause was the establishment of a national Bulgarian church worldwide without precise geographical limits and having a universal jurisdiction over all Bulgarians, even on the territory of the Church of Constantinople itself. This understanding of the Church, based on a national identity, provoked parallel jurisdictions, just as did previously the creation of Latin patriarchates and the policy of unitism. In his opening address at the inaugural session of the Holy and Great Council in June 2016, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew criticized the ethnophilitist tendency within the Orthodox Church today, which leads to each autocephalous church to close itself on its own and to function totally independently from the other autocephalous churches. He pointed out the dangers of such an atrophy of synodality at the universal level, which leads each autocephalous church to become totally independent and self-sufficient, thus giving a wrong image of the Orthodox Church not being one, but being rather a communion or federation of independent churches. I quote his speech: "While this structure of autocephaly is canonically and ecclesiologically correct, the danger of its conversion into a kind of federation of churches, each of which promotes its own interests and ambitions, which themselves are not always of a strictly ecclesiastical nature, renders necessary the application of synodality." Therefore, the Patriarch declared, if the synodal system is generally mandatory in the life of the Church, the system of autocephaly renders it still more obligatory for the protection, expression of its unity. Now I come to my conclusion. Our survey of the second millennium has shown many deviations in the exercise of primacy and synodality, both East and West. The understanding of the primacy as a universal jurisdiction in the West led to understand the resolution of the unity of the Church as a policy of return and submission to the Roman Pontiff, known as unitism, which has caused the creation of new parallel ecclesiastical structure. In the East, the ethnophilitism became a temptation for the autocephalous churches to consider themselves as self-sufficient national churches without any geographical boundaries that would exercise jurisdiction over citizens of their own nation worldwide, parallel to other churches. Also, the notion of sobornost, elaborated by the Slavophile movement in the 19th century, laicized the administration of the Church by introducing the notion of representativity of different categories, thus destroying the unity of the ecclesial body. All these tendencies provoked the loss of the sense of being one Church. A historical study of these deviations and of the pseudomorphoses which have occurred during the second millennium, and more precisely in the 19th century, can help us to purify both memories and ecclesial practices in order to recover the consciences of being one Church through a correct practice of primacy and synodality in conformity with the paradigm of the common experience of the first millennium. Thank you for your attention.